Hi, and welcome to the 78th TiddlyWiki Hangout. I'm Jeremy Ruston, the inventor of TiddlyWiki, and I'm joined today by, from left to right on my screen, Ed. Ed, would you like to say hi, where you're from, and something about your work with TiddlyWiki?
Sure. My name's Ed Dixon. I'm from Las Cruces, New Mexico. I'm a teacher, and I'm working with TiddlyWiki to use it in teaching projects, roles, trying to build a student-teacher notebook.
I'm joined today by, from left. Nicholas, I think in the background you might have the window that's playing the Hangout playing. Um, it's the window that the Q&A goes into. Anyway, I've muted you temporarily, and we'll see what happens. Thank you, Ed. Sorry for that. Jed, hi. Would you like to say hello, where you're from, and something about your work with TiddlyWiki?
Hi, I'm Jed Carty. I live in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I use TiddlyWiki to organize my thesis work for my PhD, and I also make my socks tiddlyspot.com, which is a little reference thing for TiddlyWiki, and then I play with stuff. So that's me.
Indeed, indeed. Great to have you with us again, Jed. Thank you for joining us. Mario, would you like to say hi, where you're from, and something about your work with TiddlyWiki?
Yeah, hi. My name is Mario Pitsch from Austria, near Salzburg. Contributor to TiddlyWiki Classic, and TiddlyWiki 5 is the German translation. Yeah, and I'm using TiddlyWikis for note-taking most of the time. A little bit of mind maps with TiddlyMaps lately, which is really, really nice software.
Cool. Great to have you here, Mario. Thanks for joining us. And last but not least on my screen is Steve Schneider. Steve, would you like to say hi, introduce yourself, and say where you're from and something about your work with TiddlyWiki?
Sure. My name is Steve Schneider. I'm a professor at SUNY Polytechnic Institute, which is our new name, SUNY Poly. We've been known as SUNY IT for as long as I've been at SUNY IT, which is a while. I teach courses in information design at undergraduate and graduate level. Currently, I'm using TiddlyWiki through TiddlyWeb as TiddlySpace, basically, to teach fundamental principles of hypertextuality. And I'd be glad to show you what I'm doing. I'll also use it to teach political science.
Oh gosh, I didn't realize that you did a political science course as well. That's very interesting, Steve. I'll come to you in as item number 2, if I may, Steve. And in the meantime, you may want to experiment with screen sharing, which is the green button on the left that says screen share that you have to hover to get to. Nick Spies is saying, was he cut out? No, I don't know why you dropped out, Nick, but you should try joining again, and hopefully you will be able to get in this time. So there was quite a few. Oh, we've also just been joined by Nathan. Nathan Kane, would you like to say hello, say where you're from, and something about your work with TiddlyWiki?
Sure. Hello, I'm Nathan Kane. I'm a developer from the United States, and I've been working with TiddlyWiki 5 for a little over a year now as a developer and user. And yeah.
Indeed. Great to have you here, Nathan. Nathan's been one of the several core contributors that we've got on the call today. So, as ever, you can post questions for the Hangout using the elaborate Q&A mechanism that's built into Google Hangouts. And so I'll just whiz through the questions that are posted there. And in fact, there's only they're all questions about the Hangout, excuse me, and how to join and stuff. There's a question from Branimir, though, which is, with the Blanca theme, it's not clear which tab you are on when viewing control panel. And Branimir, yes, I can readily imagine that, because the Blanca theme is not something probably that I've been back to check for quite a while. I would welcome a contribution of of a fix for that theme. But thank you for letting us know, Branimir. That's great. So that's all the questions on the Q&A panel. Do feel free to add more questions there. And otherwise, there'll be a few moments where I'll invite people to ask questions. So one of the topics that I wanted to talk about today was TiddlyPip, which is my hilarious name for a project that aims to explore the possibility of earning revenue with TiddlyWiki from the Apple App Store. So there's a few bits of unpacking that are probably worth doing here, and maybe I should even step back to the real background. As many of you will know, for the last nearly 18 months, I've been working for a London-based startup that was using TiddlyWiki as part of their product, and I was acting CTO. Sadly, that work's come to an end, and so I, as a matter of characteristic urgency, I need to look at ways of either whether it's possible for me to support myself working on TiddlyWiki, or find a job that isn't too hostile to working on TiddlyWiki in the background. At this point in time, I'm trying to explore what seem to me to be the best options, which are the ones where I somehow managed to earn money by working on TiddlyWiki. Now, one of the things that TiddlyWiki I'm very lucky about is that TiddlyWiki has a passionate group of supporters, a kind of shifting group of supporters who are vocal on the group, but I think a slightly larger group of supporters in the wider world who've been through a stage of using TiddlyWiki, etc. However, even with that ardent support, I don't think that I can support myself with money coming from TiddlyWiki supporters. I just don't think that there is enough, that set of people is large enough for it to be possible. So one of the observations that an old boss of mine, JP, made about open source was that you make money because of open source, not from it in the sense of selling it. You make money because of something that you can do with it. And I really like that idea. And here, there's questions of money, but there's also questions, there's the topic I raised at the beginning, the fact that TiddlyWiki is lucky enough to have an enthusiastic group of supporters, a group of fans. So that gave me the idea that maybe the best shape for me to try to earn money is to work with people in the TiddlyWiki community in partnership together to earn money. So with all the people that I know in the TiddlyWiki community, there's some other area of interest, typically, that has driven them towards TiddlyWiki. There's Dave Gifford with his Bible studies, for instance, would be a really great example. And I just wonder whether, in some of those cases, people might have content that's sufficiently valuable that either people might pay for it to be on the App Store, or that they themselves might be prepared to pay to see that content published on the App Store. Now, I say the Apple App Store because of all of the mobile platforms. It's the Apple App Store that seems to have the most money sloshing around in it. And so my understanding is that if you're kicking off a project that's looking at paid apps, that iOS is the place to be. But I should stipulate that I have nothing against Android, and it strikes me that a fertile TiddlyWiki ecosystem would obviously be one that includes Android apps as well. But I'd also note in passing that it's already much easier to use TiddlyWiki on Android than it is on iOS, thanks to Android's relative openness. So that was the idea. Is there anybody out there who has some content in the TiddlyWiki that we can bundle up into an app so that it can be sold on the App Store and that we can share in the proceeds? It's a very simple plan. I'm stipulating at this point that it's just a read-only TiddlyWiki. So it's exactly equivalent to the experience that you would get if you browsed TiddlyWiki on mobile Safari, except that it would be full screen and it would have a little bit of polish to make sure that it behaves like an app. In particular, for some content, we'd be able to display a static HTML version of content, which would display much quicker than loading up the full TiddlyWiki. So that's the only bit of sophistication I'm thinking of, is that we'd take the TiddlyWiki content, we'd render it in static HTML. In preference, we'd display the static HTML. When interactions require it, we would switch over to a full-blown TiddlyWiki. And the work for me is figuring out how to navigate Apple's App Store and efficiently process things so that they can be published there. And to work on this wrapper application that wraps around a TiddlyWiki. I mean, it's not really even an application, it's more of a process. So I'm imagining a batch file where I can run the batch file pointing it at blah.html, and then out the other side will pop an application that's ready to submit to the App Store. And I've seen that level of automation. Sorry, Nick, I can see you very politely raising your hand. Would you like, is there something you'd like to ask?
Yeah, a couple of things. You mentioned the user base might not be enough for you to survive on or whatnot. Do you know approximately how many users there are of TiddlyWiki?
No, and of course, it's one of the lovely questions. Back before I sold Osmosoft to BT, and when TiddlyWiki went through a period of a sort of explosive success, and I was talking to people like VCs at the time, and they would all say, "How many users are there?" And I always thought that it was a fantastic feature of TiddlyWiki. The answer is that I have no idea, because obviously of the way in which one uses TiddlyWiki offline, and you don't necessarily, there's nothing for me to count. There is no central service. I've always thought that's one of the most profoundly different and interesting characteristics of TiddlyWiki, so I always laugh when that question comes up. However, Nick, I do think that it's a number that we can make some educated guesses about. I'm not sure if I'm the best person to do it, but I mean, for instance, in the area of academia, I've found that you don't need to get very many academics in a room before you find that one of them has used TiddlyWiki. And so, for instance, that population, the world population of, let's say, English-speaking academics is, I think, that's a measurable number of people, and we can probably extrapolate what chunk of that population of people are TiddlyWiki users. But we do have. So sorry, Nick.
Sorry, I was going to ask with regard to the apps that you tend to wrap around. Would that retain the flexibility that you have with a TiddlyWiki itself, or would it conceal?
No, it would be basically if you display TiddlyWiki on mobile Safari on iOS, you get a very faithful rendering of it that's as good as a desktop browser, and that's basically we'd be reusing mobile Safari, so that's the display that you'd get in the app.
So you still could use it as an authoring tool.
Yes, but that wouldn't be the focus, because I think to create a good authoring tool as an iOS app is just phase 3. There's some other things that need to be done first, and so the idea of publishing static content as separate applications was a way to try and imagine that quite a long journey of development that would take us to a general purpose TiddlyWiki workbench on iOS, and just trying to imagine what's the earliest thing along that road that we could take to market and that there might be a chance to raise some revenue. That was the argument anyway. But maybe if TiddlyWiki was more popular, it might be possible to do a Kickstarter, for instance, to create that application, the custom TiddlyWiki application. But as to say, the well, not as I say, I haven't said this yet, but one of the things that I think is quite interesting about this is that this model uses TiddlyWiki as an authoring environment, but to people who know TiddlyWiki, it's kind of an additional publishing route that allows them to exploit everything they know about customizing TiddlyWiki. Yes, so very simple idea. And Steve, sorry, were you waving your hand to say something as well?
Well, it would be interesting to explore using it as a app for a textbook, because it would give me as a textbook author an opportunity to, in a sense, self-publish, and then the question is how often can you update it? But it doesn't have to be live, but the links could be to live supplemental content that you write during the semester. So I think it's a really wonderful concept to open.
Well,
and Open SUNY has an initiative to self-publish textbooks because it's seen as a way of creating college affordability.
Well, you're interestingly, you're echoing some of the initial reaction on the Google group when I posted this proposal about TiddlyPip. Was a couple of people who are interested in educational scenarios, and they're obviously, I think, like you, seeing the possibility of a voluminous, enormous textbook crammed into this tiny sliver of glass with its full multimedia display, and with the ability to retain persistent progress information. I don't know all the correct terms for these things, but the results of exercises and so on. I'm also really interested in that, but it's a little bit less of the first comment applies, that it requires phase 2, which is the ability to create apps that have persistent content that can be modified and that they can synchronize later. And that, Ed, is where the Tin Can API pops up. That's one of the places that we could synchronize learning progress to, and it would avoid us having to build a server infrastructure because we'd be able to reuse their existing one. Well, not but, I mean, it's something I'd love to do. I think it's a very different model commercially. I mean, the sort of special case that I was probing was about premium content that we can charge for. And in most cases, the textbook material that has been discussed so far is royalty-free, and so not necessarily something that could practically be charged for. But also it strikes me that textbooks are a really interesting special case. There's a project, a TiddlyWiki project that you may have come across called Ambit, which is, if you search for oxtwig on tiddlywiki.com, you'll find a great introductory video. Ambit is an attempt to build a special kind of textbook that's a manual for people who work with vulnerable young people, and it's run by mental health charity. And their idea is essentially a federated textbook, where before you deploy a textbook in a particular classroom, or conceivably with a particular student, the educator customizes it to the specific needs of that student. And that might be by selecting what material is included, by modifying material, changing parameters of some of the material. And that strikes me as being what teachers that I remember working with would actually have liked, is they would have liked to have been able to create their own textbook by filleting the bits that they liked from other people's textbooks. And it's doing that, I guess, is a slightly less arduous undertaking than writing a textbook from scratch. And well, I mean, and of course, there's much more material available if you're remixing other people's material. So TiddlyWiki obviously seems to me like a fantastic environment to do that for schoolwork. And we've had a terrific case recently of a maths textbook. I may, at the risk of going off topic, I'm going to just quickly show you this for people who haven't seen it. And the reason is because it's actually a really good example of the kind of static content that we could publish right now. So you can see scrolling down here that this is a version of a textbook by Matt Bulkins, whose name I'm probably mispronouncing. It's split into chapters, each of which is split into sub-chapters. You may be able to see that as I click on links, it's kind of slow to switch tabs. That's for the best possible reason, that the content is assembled very dynamically from very small constituent parts. So that's a... Sorry, it stopped screen sharing. So I'm showing you that just because to show that kind of thing is already happening. You know, that's a standalone textbook. The bit that I was describing that doesn't show is this idea of federation of textbooks, of me being able to say, I'll have a copy of that textbook over there, but with these chapters swapped around. Sorry, Nick.
But you are aware that textbooks are a huge cash cow for publishers.
Yes, yes. And I think that it's the kind of industry that I would, without being too, you've got to be considerate of other people's perspectives. But I'd slightly look at the textbook industry as being a product of an industrial era that we're past, where the means to produce textbooks was just only a few people had that capability. So the federation notion. So this is, to be clear, sorry, Nick, a better response to your question, to your comment, would be yes. Let's obliterate the textbook publishing industry. I mean, I think this is exactly the sort of that federated textbook world that I described is really just applying open source to teaching. It's saying let's share our resources and our infrastructure, and let's allow modifying of one another's work. I'm confident that it will lead to better work than any of us could produce on our own. Anyway, but with this is still a TiddlyPip discussion, and so as far as TiddlyPip is concerned, I think that the opportunity for federated textbooks would, I mean, might well be something that could be made to fit iOS, as in one could imagine one of the risks of all of this is Apple's guidelines for the App Store. But you could imagine making it so that updates from people were packaged as in-app purchases, and I might love the free notes that I've seen by Steve on the Stanford political science lecture so much that I'm prepared to pay $5 to have the rights to distribute Steve's notes for such and such another chunk of lectures that haven't been released yet. But I don't know. I don't know enough, obviously, about the textbook market, and why would I, to know the best way to make money in it. But then I think my job is to understand the software and how it might help the underlying problem, and then work with people in the community who do understand the textbook industry. And so, in fact, one of the I've been having extensive discussions off the mailing list with a guy called Richard Smith, who's the author of that math textbook that I just showed you. And it happens that he is, and I'm sure there's many people in the group who've had some experience of the textbook publishing industry, but who's certainly got the experience of that industry that I lack. So I think the status of the educational stuff at the moment is the current TiddlyPip proposal is great for anybody who's got textbook material that they want to publish, probably for free, non-commercially. But the hope is that we could do it as paid work. That would be static, by static I'd mean that standalone, self-contained, but could contain multimedia content. Doing the more interesting federated textbook thing, I think, is a big enough opportunity that if there's enough of us interested in it, then and we can sort of see a route to funding the development of such a thing, then I think that's kind of a separate project. And as I say, maybe a great time for it. Ambit, Dickens' project with child mental health stuff, has done very well, and there is some interest in replicating it in other fields within the same organization. And I think that that could go broader, and if TiddlyWiki was ready with a platform which could support that kind of federation, that would be awesome. But parenthetically, of course, in the UK at least, we don't tend to have iOS devices in the health service. I think iPads are very popular in schools here, but it's not healthcare. I think God knows what they use, something cheaper. So any questions before I just move on to the next bit I was going to cover?
Sorry, go ahead.
Nick, it's fine, it's you.
Oh, okay. I would suggest one potential application would be a genealogy program.
Oh, genius, yes. Very clever, yes. Very good, very good.
And that would require, however, the ability to create a tree structure very easily within TiddlyWiki. So I've come up with an idea of how to do that.
Well, yeah, I think the table of contents shows a tree structure as well.
Yes, but I'm proposing to have one menu, like a rooted tree, using one button that would be called path, and it would be variously populated depending on which tiddler you are on and how that.
Oh yes, no, I've seen your question about this. So this is what we might call breadcrumbs, wanting to show the breadcrumbs that took you to the current tiddler. Yeah.
I can give you or let's see if I can figure out how to show you the picture.
In fact, Nick, before we get sidetracked to that, I'd like to just finish the. No, it's fine. And it was something that I did. I mean, I saw your post to the group about it, and I'm sorry I didn't manage to pick it up then, but it was something I was interested in as well. But no, let me just finish the TiddlyPip stuff. So you can see that the discussion that we've just had, there's basically two kinds of things going on. One is that people are suggesting things that are not quite the TiddlyPip that I had proposed, but are other ways of potentially making money. And I think the federated textbook thing is probably in that category. And I'm really interested in that stuff, just because I posted about TiddlyPip so specifically. That was an attempt to try and articulate one possible idea so that we could analyze it and explore it. But I'm really keen to do that with as many decent-looking ideas as possible, particularly because all the interesting ideas really depend on you guys in the community, because I think it's when we marry what we've got in the TiddlyWiki core, the capabilities of the TiddlyWiki core, with your specific experience of particular fields that where there is money sloshing about, that we stand some chance of making this fly. So,
I might add,
please do.
The book that I co-authored went into, it's out of the publisher's hands now, and it could actually be published. It's maybe not of general interest on 4th.
Well, it would be the kind of thing that, I think this is something I hadn't anticipated. I was interested in people, I was asking if people had content that could be made into paid content. It turns out a lot of the people who answered exactly fitted the bill, but it sounds like free content. So that basically means that one of the services that I would be offering is essentially vanity publishing, which, I mean, sounds bad in the context of a book, but in the context of an application or a website, there is no other sort. Nobody pays to build your website for you, and nobody's going to pay to build your app for you in the same way. But if we can get the costs down, I think that it could become like, well, if you use iPhoto on the Mac, you fiddle around with your photos on it, and every so often you see a button that says, would you like to buy a book of these photos? And every so often I do, and it's pretty cool. And similarly, you could be working with TiddlyWiki and decide, gosh, that's a storming piece of work. Let's stamp it out on the App Store for $200. Now, I'm not proposing to be able to do it for $200 initially, but I don't see any reason why we couldn't bring the cost down extraordinarily low if we did the necessary engineering on the process. And it just the next thing I was going to say was that based on all of the reaction I've had so far, what I've been doing so far is, since the post just before the weekend, is drafting a Kickstarter campaign for this. So this is really because one of the bits of feedback that we had on the group was somebody essentially pledging money, and so I thought, well, if that's going to happen, if people would like to pledge, then let's make it possible for them to do so meaningfully. And obviously, by starting a Kickstarter, it places a bar on, people have to put their credit card in and so on, and actually stump up with the cash at some point. So that's what I hope to release over the next few days, is a draft of that Kickstarter campaign for people in the community to look at. Basically, the rewards, and you'll be aware from, first I should say this is a differently structured campaign slightly than Eric's. The way that Kickstarter works is that you nominate a sum of money, and if you don't hit that sum of money, then all the backers get their money back again. So it's, and that's good for me, because there is, what makes sense for me is to raise enough money to be able to live on for a period of time to be able to undertake the work. And if I wasn't able to raise enough money to be able to cover the time necessary to do the work, then it wouldn't be much use, and it wouldn't be much use to have half the money. So in this particular case, Kickstarter fits quite well, even though it's different than what Eric did, where his campaign, he got the money even if they didn't hit the target. The other thing about Kickstarter is it runs for 30 days. I think Eric's ran for 60 days.
It's over, I think.
Yes, and now it's over, of course. So what the rewards are, these are what people get when they back certain sums of money, is basically I've put £500. You get publishing of a complete TiddlyWiki to the Apple App Store as a free application. For £1,000, you get publishing of a complete TiddlyWiki to the App Store plus one subsequent content update. £2,000, you get more content updates, and you get consultancy work from me to help make the content and the presentation be as good as possible. So, and then there's a £5,000 pledge. I'm sorry, £5,000 reward for publishing a complete TiddlyWiki as a free app with in-app purchases for premium content. So we'll see. It just seems like I sent a message asking, "Are you interested?" The reply roughly was, yeah, I could be interested. So by doing a Kickstarter, that I think is the next stage of firming up people's commitment to see whether whether they are actually prepared to step up and put some money into it. So we'll see how that goes. I'm going to try not to spend too much time on it, because I don't know if this is a going concern. The purpose of doing the Kickstarter is to see whether there is that kind of money out there, and it's not. It's not at all. I have no particular reason to believe that there is. Having seen how Eric's fundraising campaign was pretty respectable, but I think it showed that as I was saying before, really, that the TiddlyWiki community is relatively small and not in of itself a terrific source of revenue.
I think, Jeremy, I think that the main problem here is publicity. So if you get some bloggers to post about the campaign, then you'll get a lot of page views. So it's not true that you get money, but at least you get page views. And only having a link on the TiddlyWiki group, it's about for, I don't know, 5,000 users. And maybe half of them are active.
Yeah.
So that's not enough. I think you need some covering at, I don't know, Reddit or TechCrunch or whatever. So when you get posts there, then I think you get a lot of hits.
I think that's also, I would agree that's true. The thing about this though is that my question was to the TiddlyWiki community, because the people who've got content and expertise to publish stuff on TiddlyWiki stuff on the App Store probably are in the discussion group. So I mean, in fact, that means that the audience that I'm addressing is even smaller than the audience of TiddlyWiki enthusiasts. So there's plenty of well, I think the real difficulty with this is that it looks like, we're doing it as a Kickstarter, is that it could look like pledge money to support Jeremy so that he can work on TiddlyWiki. And as I say, that isn't really sustainable. There just isn't enough money. And I I spend money on food and accommodation and so on. So what am I trying to say?
Well, you really are looking for a killer app to be associated with TiddlyWiki, I think. And
that would be cool. That would be cool. But that kind of, that's not the bet that I'm taking here. The bet that I'm taking here is, can we get enough TiddlyWiki documents that people would like to publish on the App Store, that there's enough volume that I can fund the work, and that then gets me a bit closer to the phase 2 and phase 3 that we talked about earlier, which do have some possibility of revenue raising. I mean, I think. I was going to show you this amazing app on the iPad, Workflow, which is it's an app for sort of stringing together actions. When I click this, do this, do this, and to the degree that it's possible on iOS, which is a bit limited, it lets you assemble these things into packaged workflows, which you can then add to the home screen. It's incredibly clever, and it's kind of TiddlyWiki-esque, not in the sense it doesn't do anything that TiddlyWiki does, and its its user interface is all very drag and droppy, where TiddlyWiki's is kind of not. But the thing that's related, it crossed my mind, was the kind of mindset of the people who like that stuff. That, as we discussed before, there's a sense of being technical that applies to TiddlyWiki users that's not technical in the JavaScript sense, but technical in some more general sense about how they approach using tools, for instance.
Well, I would suggest this. Look back, way back into the 80s, and Hypercard, and learn lessons that made Hypercard such an incredibly useful tool for so many different things. Now, there's some lost opportunities, I think, so far in TiddlyWiki, as far as it's having a rather obscure the spare syntax for creating filters and that kind of thing.
Look, Nick, I'm going to stop you, and I'm so sorry to do that, but it's only because the topic is about.
I may be missing your point.
No, it's fine. What I was going to say was that I think you're falling into a trap that I've fallen into in the past, which is to think of plans for the future that are predicated on making improvements to TiddlyWiki. And the thing that's struck me very much over the last couple of months is that I've got to stop doing that, because making that moment, the time when you're making improvements to TiddlyWiki so that you can do such and such with it, is time that one isn't exploiting it. So I think where we are at the moment is that TiddlyWiki is what it is. Now, it could be a lot of other things, and some of those other things that it can be kind of morphed into perhaps quite straightforwardly. But we've got to, or I've got to try to make money out of it as it is now. I mean, to a certain extent, one's making money on its potential, but the thing that I can't do is get myself into this loop where, you know, I write a new plugin architecture or something, and then come up for the air at the end of that and go, right, now, what are we going to do about earning money? So in terms of improving TiddlyWiki now, as I say, TiddlyWiki 5.1 is what it is. If any improvements that are made now, you know, absolutely, there will be improvements to the core, but the fastest way for anybody to improve TiddlyWiki is in plugins now, because we've got this backwards compatibility obligation in the core that will, you know, always slow down development of the core compared to in plugin land. And as I say, for me, in terms of trying to figure out revenue streams, I've got to make it out of what TiddlyWiki is today. So thank you, everybody. Any further questions or thoughts about the TiddlyPip stuff?
Well, I still think that there should be, in order to make TiddlyWiki an acceptable and profit-making tool in academia, to make it the first choice for writing LaTeX articles, which means essentially, it does mean a bit of finagling in order to translate the markup used in TiddlyWiki into the markup which is LaTeX. But that would be a tremendous selling point, I think, which may not answer your immediate question.
I couldn't disagree at all. A LaTeX plugin for TiddlyWiki would be a very useful thing.
A generalized one, yeah. I mean, I understand you already have a mathematical.
No, indeed. I think we talked about it briefly last week. I think there's a couple of fruitful avenues for exploration. One is converting HTML output by TiddlyWiki into LaTeX, but the other is slightly modified rendering widgets so that those widgets output LaTeX themselves. And I'm not sufficiently familiar with LaTeX to know how easy that would be, but it must be possible. You know, it's another text-based format, just like HTML.
Right.
So what I was going to, there's a few topics now written down still, but I was going to ask Steve. I'm sorry that the previous discussion took longer than expected. That is kind of what happens on Hangouts. But Steve, are you in a position to demo your work now, by any chance? Steve, you're muted, actually.
There we go.
Ah, brilliant. Excellent. So, yes, I mean, you gave a brief introduction, but when did you, let's just take us, before you show us what you've been doing, can you take us through the timeline of when you discovered TiddlyWiki Classic, I guess, and when you adopted TiddlySpace?
Yeah, sure. I think in 2005 or 6, I had a contract with MIT Press, and they had agreed to publish our book online, X amount of content, but they wouldn't allow us to have any sort of server interface. And so I wanted to have a more of an interactive book, and I somehow came across TiddlySpace or TiddlyWiki, lost it for a few months and found it again, and then spent the summer writing a book in TiddlyWiki, which I think is still online somewhere. And then put it aside for a few years and came back and worked in TiddlySpot. I've taught a bunch of classes in which my course materials are presented in some form of TiddlyWiki, and I've also often, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Sorry about that. And also have students writing in TiddlyWiki in various platforms, various incarnations. I've had a bunch of master students write theses in TiddlyWiki and at times about TiddlyWiki. And so now I teach using TiddlyWiki as it's rendered through TiddlySpace in the course that you're probably looking at now, designing interactive text. And so the course is about how to create, it's really about creating hypertext, but that just doesn't draw students, so I call them interactive texts. And I use TiddlySpace as the authoring platform to teach the concepts of hypertext. And then I'm also teaching a political science class in which the course materials are all rendered through TiddlySpace, and students have their own spaces and they write their own content. I call that writing against the text. So they write sort of into the text. Is that enough of an introduction?
That's great, Steve. Thank you. I was just on the things you mentioned in the intro, I'd be very interested to know how many students over the years you've exposed to TiddlyWiki and TiddlySpace, and whether you can make any, whether you can draw any conclusions about the ease with which they take to it. Are there, for instance, is there a population of a percentage of students who never get comfortable with it?
Yeah, I'd say probably 100 to 150 over the years, maybe a few more than that. I'd say the substantial majority of the students hate the interface and fight against it, especially if they're reading. If they're only reading, they find it very difficult. But especially initially, and maybe half of them will come around to see its value, and about 10% get, maybe 20% get intrigued, and will then, especially if they're interested in it, will then take a class in designing these texts. And then they come around to seeing, I think, the TiddlyWiki as an authoring platform. I've not really ever explored it as a you know, in a substantial way as a platform for readers. I think it needs different front end work. So when I use it just for reading, it doesn't really.
No audio.
Oh, Steve, you cut. Yeah, you cut out. Steve, I must say that is, sadly, that is indistinguishable from a connection drop. But wasn't what Steve was saying about those numbers fascinating?
Jeremy, I have some numbers too, because a lot of spaces use a theme that I created as a basic, but then he changed it, and there are about 400 spaces which use this theme, and I think it's about 2/3 which is related to Sunny IT.
Okay.
And this is quite interesting. And also what's very, very interesting is the content of those spaces that people write. So it's great stuff there. And a lot of complaints about the UI.
I've come back now.
Oh, Steve, welcome back. We were.
I don't know where I left off my complaints, but all I heard when I came back was complaints about UI.
Yes.
Yeah, Steve, I was telling Jeremy that because you used the new UI theme as a theme basics, I see the information how many spaces include this theme, and it's about 400 spaces, and I think it's about 2/3 is from Sunny IT. So the spaces that use the new UI theme.
Okay, the new, yeah. So I think we've okay. So let me try to share the screen again. Is my screen screen share?
Yeah.
And so We, SUNY IT, TS Learning.
Where is the SUNY located?
SUNY IT is in Utica. I guess I don't remember the.
Okay.
Oh, I know what it is. Give me 1 second. Sorry about this. I hadn't really thought of approaching it this way. SUNY IT is a unit of State University of New York Institute of Technology, and so we're the Institute of Technology. We're in Central New York, and we've just merged with another campus to become SUNY Polytechnic. So now we're the Nano College of the university. So, and our work in Tiddly space starts with this, with a theme that I guess we did adapt it from Nui theme. And one of my students did this as a project. And then this forms we run. And so my course, and so there's a whole series of plugins in this, and to be honest, that's stuff that Doug kind of organized, and he took a bunch of plugins that we started, and I don't remember exactly what he did. My end is always over here as the instructor, and so would it be helpful to sort of to spend 5 minutes walking through how I've organized this class, or?
Yes, please do.
Okay. So in this class, where they're actually designing text, the class is built on a series of modules, and students come in and create a new space for each module. Because especially for these students who are the designers and they're getting into the code, etc., I find that it's much better for them to start with a fresh space every week or 2 weeks. It's got some problems with inheriting over time, but I think it works pretty well. And so in this class, I think we're up to module 3, and so I constantly have to reiterate to them that they have to create a new space every time and how to do that. And so I teach them the theories of inclusion, etc., through or transclusion of spaces through that approach. So I think we'll take a look at what we did in module 2 as a project.
What is the overall objective of the course? I mean, other than what, you know, beyond the obvious. I mean, what are the applications of hypertext that you envision your students going on and forming a career around?
I envision them understanding as information designers who are going to be designing for any number of platforms, most likely not Tiddly space. I want them to understand the
like game design, that type of thing.
Sure. It's built in a theory of ubiquitous hypertextuality.
Do you know Ted Nelson by any chance?
Well, I start pretty much with Ted Nelson, and so let me.
Okay. Yeah, I've communicated with him. I actually roomed in his same room at Swarthmore the year after he graduated. So strange connection. But
yeah, so sort of the more theoretical approach, and I don't know how this translates on the screen, so I'd be interested to know. This is another part of the work that we've developed in Tiddly space, so we can run through a series of.
Oh yeah, I have that book. Yeah.
Yeah, you have a copy of that book. Those are really expensive.
Yeah, they're about $400 now. Yeah.
And so I start the students here, and I want them to understand that designing hypertext, I want them to get to the point where they write hypertextually, so that as they're writing, they're thinking through the components of hypertext, which is linking and tagging, exclusion, filtering, and sorting. And so that's really, so what I'm trying to do is teach that, and I model each one of these techniques by having them understand how to generate something that does one of these things, filtering or sorts or links or transcludes, in Tiddly space. Then they get to code, and they can't really replicate this in any other platform. So for me, TiddlyWiki is the purest form of teaching students how to write and think hypertextually, and ultimately I want them to think hypertextually. So that's
is this a way of making them capable of multiprocessing?
It's more an associational thinking than multiprocessing. So that the idea of, I think I did this in module 2.
I mean, I don't want to interrupt you.
Sure, no. There's no. So here, for example, I have them create a table that looks something like this. And that's actually their first assignment. So that, and then I taught them to tag up. So these parties became tagged a political party, etc. So that they move from the two-dimensional representation of a spreadsheet to this multi-dimensional representation of objects. So it's sort of object-oriented text is where it's how I approach it. And I think that students who understand this then understand the connections between Twitter and Facebook, for example, or between search engines and search query results, and they're well prepared for any number of digital media careers, I hope.
Next question did touch on something though, which is that although you're teaching hypertext, you're kind of teaching the students to use their brain better, and presumably some of the techniques the techniques for associative thinking might even be applicable if they're not physically writing in hypertext at the time. Is that right? Do you see it?
So that's over here. So I do that in this class. So this is a class in political science and bioethics. Okay, and so here I'm using my own understanding of hypertext to try and get them to see connections across these 4 issues that we cover. So there's and then by tagging these, so they're gonna write. So we cover a set of 4 issues, and as things get tagged to these ideas, they're ultimately going to. Let me pull up week 2, and so they read these news articles, for example, and generate tiddlers that are tagged to those, and then.
So one of the benefits is you have access to original material or source material, whatever you might call it, immediately.
I bring in student material into the course, okay, and so they write the text for the text of the course. They write through their own Tiddly spaces. In this case, they're submitting Google Forms. In this particular class, as these things will get introduced, they're going to begin to identify activities in the political system, a court case or whatever it is, using these sort of contemporary articles that they find, and then they'll tag them up. So what kind of government action is being involved, what's philosophical perspective, what political actors are involved. And over time, they'll get to see that executives do certain kinds of things, and that autonomy cuts across multiple cases. And that's the associational thinking that I build through the tag search config. In this class, I control these categories. In the other class, I teach the categorization and the building of this kind of structure.
I taught Hypercard, actually. I'm sorry, excuse me.
Steve?
Yeah, I remember Hypercard.
what's the background of your students? Okay, for this I think it's clear, but for the first stuff where you teach writing hypertextually, what's the background of your students? Because I think they are from different, or they have different education backgrounds.
They some of them come with HTML understanding.
Mm-hmm.
Some don't. Some come as programmers from computer science. Most don't.
Are they humanities students?
My program is in the humanities.
Yes.
And so a lot of them are graphic designers. But so I tend to, and so we also have, we do get some of the game designers. And I'm increasingly getting students who are taking to this approach, to the TiddlyWiki world approach, who are into games, fan fiction, interact, all of those, and so there's this
that's kind
element
of
of college students who are attracted to it, and we have a lot of those students. So I've just started teaching these courses more enthusiastically, the design courses. This is the second version of this course. So we'll see how it goes, but it's
sounds fascinating.
I'm sorry.
Sounds fascinating.
I'm trying to get to write it.
Do you have some numbers if it helps them to work with TiddlyWiki, or I don't know, when they stop the course, do they abandon it, or are there some that use TiddlyWiki for their own, I don't know, note taking or whatever? So do they stay with TiddlyWiki or not?
I haven't tracked it. That would be interesting to do. I think there's only one person that I know of that took TiddlyWiki to a client, and I don't know how long that lasted or how well it went. I mean, again, my own sense is that I was very interested in Jeremy's opening topic, was that it's an amazing authoring platform. It's the rendering that's difficult, but I think that in 5, I'd probably find that much better. And then the concept of throwing it to an app is really intriguing for static content. But it's the dynamism, I think, that's important. And so losing that would be a hard thing for me to deal with, because to me, it's the value of TiddlyWiki comes from the fact that I can continuously update it and move it. But not necessarily. So it's got it. I mean, I can go either way. I've got one student who's using it potentially as a tool for presenting film. Ooh. So he's tagging up. Have you seen that elsewhere?
No, but it's I've successfully, I think, made TW5 make images be a first-class citizen, and my fantasy is to make video be a first-class citizen, so that you can, for instance, transclude chunks of video.
But Rich Schumacher did a marvelous thing with.
He's interested in this stuff too.
Yeah.
Yeah, he wants to. We want to tag short video clips, and then in something like a tag grid. So it's where I think I still have the screen. I'm not sure, but where did we do that? News articles we read last week. Where did we do tag grid? Oh, here I've got experts. Why is that happening in front of me there? But we're running something like tag grid, and then if those could be video clips, that could be assembled and played on the fly. Now, is that something, Jeremy, you could do in the app?
Yes, definitely. And I mean, it's not what I'm including in the main, TiddlyPip proposal, because that's still just about the read-only publishing. But yeah, I mean, never mind doing it in an app, we can do it on the web to an amazing degree. We showed last week there's a Mozilla project that's 2 or 3 years old now to make a video editor out of web technologies, and it doesn't quite succeed. But we're here not quite talking about a video editor. We're talking about sort of a video sequencer. And that technology definitely exists. I mean, as in we can use the video element and CSS and so on. So we can, for instance, we can play one clip on top of the other and use CSS to fade between them. So a lot of things that used to be video production matters can now be done on the fly as part of the playing experience. So yes, I mean, Steve, if you're if I'm getting this, the sniff of a commercial opportunity to explore interactive video delivery with TiddlyWiki, then we should talk.
Yeah, because I mean, I'm focused, especially, yes, we should talk, yeah, because I start in the educational market, but with our new university configuration, we're much more, I'm working in a very different environment than I was a year ago, and I'm trying to take advantage of that. I think it's open to much innovation, so that would be fun. So, are
there job openings there?
Yeah, they're all on the web. Yeah, there are actually, but not in this. But there's a lot of jobs. I mean, it's an economic development engine is what it's supposed to be, and so yeah.
Well, I belabored this before, but I was a video editor for most of my career, and essentially went through this whole process every time I edited something. I mean, that is to say, explore a lot of parallel things. But the primary thing that I came up with was what I consider, and I've said before, that I was the point of a non-interactive video is to find the optimal path.
Yes.
And that is kind of at odds with having any number of paths open for the end user.
Yes. I think that may well be part of what Steve's course talks about in terms of literature, because you can make the same point with traditional writing, is choosing a linear path through your ideas.
I would very much like to continue talking with him, when this conference is over, if possible.
Well, I will be disappearing at the usual sort of time, but the call will stay open in the normal way. Any other thoughts on what Steve was saying?
Well, I thought it was very fascinating, but insofar as I understood it, it was kind of hard to see from.
Well, I had the advantage of being a little bit familiar with looking over Steve's shoulder while he's been doing his work on TiddlySpace. I was going to say actually that Steve, the web supplement that you did for MIT, that you mentioned at the beginning of your intro, I for many years used that in my talks about TiddlyWiki, using you particularly as the object of the story, and it was the way that what I saw in that supplement. So the part that you said was how MIT were happy to let you host a custom HTML page, but they wouldn't have let you host what would it have been then, a social text wiki or whatever server-side wiki you might have explored. But when I looked at the material that you'd produced, I saw that you were using lots and lots of plugins in a way that's very familiar, and that a couple of the plugins were written by Steve Schneider. And then when I looked more closely, I realized that at least one of the plugins was actually a very a modest modification of another plugin by another guy whose plugin was also in the wiki. And so the cool thing for me was it gave me an example I could point to of somebody who was a domain expert in something else, but who was able to, because of TiddlyWiki's slightly unique qualities, was able to pretend to be a developer for just long enough to get a plugin working, because that's so often the quickest route to making progress. Then the second you have to engage somebody else, get somebody else's help, is the moment when you slow down. So I love that. I really love that. And I think that showed something that you've again showed us today, which is that you yourself have this capacity to envision what the system should do and the patience to figure out how to do it with all the terrible warts and blemishes that TiddlySpace and TiddlyWiki embody. And it's an amazing combination. And I mean, goodness, when you see what you've produced over these 3 or 4 years, it's stunning in terms of the amount of learning, I think, that it incorporates. You've been able to iterate it many times, and your project is, I think, one of the larger TiddlyWiki projects. And certainly in terms of the number of people exposed to TiddlyWiki, if that was our scientific measure of project size. And yes, I was charmed when I first discovered that hypertext writing was something that one could take a course in. Seems like the most fascinating and diverting area to study, and it's really encouraging that we live in a world where higher education offers that as a course. Mostly, I get dismayed by how backwards looking the world is, and how I'm not always convinced that our educational system is preparing people for the century that they are actually going to live in. And so that's really cool, and the topic is very close to my heart.
Well, one of the thoughts that I've had, although it's not a current one, is to colonize English composition classes or freshman composition classes around the world with TiddlyWiki. And so I think that would create a different kind of a world. But it's not a serious thought, but it sort of is a serious thought, and it's interesting to try and to see how students react to it. So it's.
And I hope, I mean, maybe with TiddlyWiki 5 being a lot easier to make sort of wholesale configuration changes, that it might be easier for somebody with TiddlyWiki 5 to evolve a tool that was suitable for an audience like that. Well, I mean, I keep thinking this because,
I shouldn't just switch, right?
Oh gosh, yes, you should totally start experimenting with TiddlyWiki 5. But the main newbie objection to TiddlyWiki is that it doesn't have wysiwyg, and that's not a discussion that we're going to have today because it's a very long discussion. But the heartening thing is that, of course, we're surrounded by tools that don't have wysiwyg. Most smartphones, when you enter text in a smartphone, you don't have wysiwyg. The places that I know of on the iPhone where you can do bold and italics are clumsy as all hell, and not really something that that you could use very speedily. What am I trying to say?
Well, for college students, they think in tweets.
Yes.
And
yes.
And Twitter.
And tweets to plain text as well.
Exactly, and a hashtag is the first step in markup, and it doesn't, So I often say, you basically, for those of you who are afraid of code, you need some angle brackets and some square brackets, and that's about it, and a couple of commands here and there. And so but again, for students in the field, I think it's very good for them to go through the TiddlyWiki world, and even if they never use it again. And so I think that to think of how many of them adopted it as the metric of TiddlyWiki's success, again, as an educational tool, I think is incredibly valuable.
Yeah. No, I take it to be like
struggling with it, and I will come up.
To have left an imprint on them while they were working with TiddlyWiki is enough.
I could use TiddlyWiki 5 to publish a blog at this point fairly straightforwardly.
Yeah. And there are people, particularly Nathan is one of them, who've been working on publishing static content from TiddlyWiki. So for things like a blog, you can publish pure HTML files that get properly indexed by Google and so on, but have those pages emitted from, say, your personal TiddlyWiki that you store in Dropbox or what have you. So there's a couple of good, effective ways to work with TiddlyWiki 5. One is to use the TiddlyFox extension for Firefox. One is to use TiddlyDesktop, which is our custom browser. And the other is to use the Node.js edition. I mean, I would say work with TiddlyFox and Firefox. That's, I think, by far the majority platform for the single file work. And TiddlyWiki 5, although it runs under Node.js as well as a server, most of what it does, it can do in the standalone edition. And certainly while you're playing with it, you might find that the easiest to play with.
I'll
Brilliant.
try that out.
Steve, thank you very much for showing us that. I hope that you'll continue to come to Hangouts when you can. It's really great to, after all this time, to to see you explain what you've been doing in your own words. And
I have a question for you too. One of the things that I'm doing is I have this semester I'm doing more live of this kind of work, and I teach a class on Wednesday mornings. That would be interesting to have guests attend if anyone was ever interested in talking to the students who are using it, and to giving them a chance to sort of explain what they're doing and perhaps demo what they've got, and you could say, oh, well, perhaps you could do this.
Oh gosh, yeah, no, I'd be a sucker to do that. I'd love to. We're always very happy.
Okay. I'll send you an invite.
And then I think your Wednesday morning is my Wednesday afternoon, so in fact, although I can't do this week, very often I would be able to do that.
Could make a YouTube.
Okay. Yeah, it would.
Yeah,
that would be great. Yeah.
I think we could record it too. Yeah, to do it as a hangout.
Okay, great.
Brilliant, Steve. Thank you very much. Much appreciated. I'm just going to quickly look at my list. There was there's one other kind of biggish topic that I wanted to bring up. So perhaps before doing that, I should ask if anybody has any burning issues that they would like to bring up. And it's rather belatedly, but perhaps I could also, Alberto, could I say hi and ask you to introduce yourself? You got a microphone?
Hi, Jeremy. I'm Alberto Molina, and I use the TiddlyWiki Classic since I don't know which year, and now I'm an enthusiast of TiddlyWiki 5. And I'm creating a plugin to try to do some things which is called MagicTabs.
Yes. And of course the TW5 Scholars is your work.
Yes. And the MagicTabs thing is just an improvement, a generalization of that.
The components within it. It's interesting that you've, I mean, I know you joined us some time ago, but hopefully you saw Steve's work as well. And I would draw a comparison between what I've seen of the way that both of you work, that you're both driven, it seems, by a very clear idea of what you're trying to achieve, and both have the right kind of patience and doggedness to get it done. I may say when I first saw Alberto's TW5 Scholars TiddlySpot, which I think was quite a while ago, maybe nearly a year ago, perhaps even by now. So it was the first time I'd seen an adaptation of TiddlyWiki 5 which kind of extended it and turned it into something else. And yeah, it's a beautiful piece of work, and I think lots of people are going to be very interested, Alberto, when your plugin toolkit is available.
Yes, of course, and I think soon it will be available.
Oh, great! Well, very very pleased to hear
and
it.
It's just an extension of the TiddlyWiki for Scholars, but the idea is to make it available for everybody to do different things, not only for scholars.
Yes, indeed, but I think the scholars. The way that you packaged it originally as an offering for scholars made it really clear, and it was one of the things that communicated so beautifully the first time I saw it. So I hope you'll continue to do scholars as a demo of your plugins.
Yes, yes, yes.
Excellent. Well, so the topic that I have to discuss now, there's a slight echo. Oh, Alberto, is he? Is a complicated one, but it's one that I'm quite excited about. It makes a nice contrast with TiddlyPip because TiddlyPip is about the matters of the real world, and this next topic takes us straight back into TiddlyWiki's, the heart of TiddlyWiki's functionality and its potential for the future. So the topic is about federation, and we're going to touch on some things that have come up before, particularly some of the recent conversations that Rich Schumacher kicked off. So here's the thing. When I got back from holiday, so within the last week or so, I added the Punjabi and Hindi translations that Atul Grover contributed. Hopefully I'm now screen sharing, yes. And I'll show you them because I've said many times in Hangouts that the different translations of TiddlyWiki, and particularly the different scripts, are one of the amazing pleasures for me. That there's a really weird and fun feeling when I see something that's so familiar as the control panel of TiddlyWiki, but rendered not only in a language that I can't read, but in an alphabet that I can't read. So that was Punjabi, and this is Hindi. They both look awesome. The downside is that adding those two plugins has caused TiddlyWiki.com, the index file, to grow to 4.5 megabytes. And somehow that's triggered my alarm that that's just too big. And it means that at the moment the experience of navigating to TiddlyWiki.com is already, it's quite a delay while you wait for all that stuff to come down the network, and another 800 kilobytes of plugins, say, knocking us up to 4.5 megabytes is going to make it even worse. So I've been in the background thinking about that problem a little, and part of the obvious answer is to cut all of the language plugins out into their own editions, so that TiddlyWiki.com/index.html would just have English in it, and if you wanted to get another language, you'd click a link to get to TiddlyWiki.com/languages/en something or other, and you'd get to an English edition from which you could drag that plugin. But the trouble I felt with that was that it discourages experimentation. I really like the way that we've got all of the language plugins available on TiddlyWiki.com so that people can idly flick between them. So it feels like being able to explore it properly. So that was the concern about. So moving the plugins into separate editions is almost certainly what we'll have to do, and I think it needs to be done for 5.1.8. But I felt it wasn't a great solution, and it got me thinking about an ambition for TiddlyWiki that I've had for some time but couldn't get in before we came out of beta, and that's the ability to install plugins from within TiddlyWiki. What I mean by that is, whilst you're looking at a TiddlyWiki in a file URI in Firefox or a TiddlyWiki hosted in TiddlySpot, you should be able to press a button that obtains a listing of the plugins available on TiddlyWiki.com, allows you to install or update any plugins that you choose, and save changes and restart, and off you go. And that experience, at the moment, we're really not there. To get a plugin, you have to go to TiddlyWiki.com, you have to find a page that has a link to that plugin, and then you have to drag that link into your wiki. So it's the worst kind of hideous process, because it's a little bit different for each plugin, the place where you'd go and find that link. And of course...
So essentially you want dynamic libraries.
That would be one way of looking at it, yes. So the... but where was I? The desired functionality...
I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. I'll get it back in a moment. Anyway, yes. So that I think would be a great user experience. And the problem at the moment is that with current technology, I can't even produce a page which has a link to each plugin that can be dragged and dropped. And the reason why I can't is because that page would have to contain all of the plugins in order to be able to generate those links, which would mean that it would be 10 megabytes or something. The complete set of plugins is getting bigger all the time. So I was looking for starting to think about ways that we might implement that experience of being able to install the plugin. The obvious answer is something called an XML HTTP request, which is a way in JavaScript within the browser to be able to obtain a file by its URL from elsewhere. Excuse me, from elsewhere on the internet. The trouble is that browsers have something called the same origin policy, which places very strict restrictions on where a page can talk to. And so in particular, a page that's loaded from a file URI these days can't talk to the internet. So that's suggestion number one out of the window, that we couldn't have a page that's sitting in Firefox in a file URI doing a XML HTTP request to request a plugin from TiddlyWiki.com. The browser simply doesn't allow it. There's another technique that developers use to work around that restriction, and it's called JSON-P, and it's where you dynamically create a script tag in the browser pointing to a remote server, and it then obtains the file from the remote server and executes it as JavaScript. So it has the effect of allowing you to obtain data from any server, but the crippling disadvantage of it is that you hand the keys to the page to that script that you include via JSON-P, and that's because it's executed with global context. It can do what it likes. So JSON-P, although there are many situations where it's a safe and reasonable technology to use, it's not good in precisely the situations that I'd be quite interested in for TiddlyWiki. That's the ability to connect to broadly to serve as the basis for federation. So I came upon another technique which I've now run some experiments with, and the idea here is that you use window post message and an embedded iframe. So let me unpack that a little. Window post message is an API that in JavaScript a page can use to send messages to, in this case, an iframe. Those messages are what's called a dictionary, so it's just a list of name-value pairs that gets passed across, and the messages are asynchronous. So you can have a window that's got an iframe within it. Within the window, you have an event handler that's listening for messages on the window, and that allows the iframe to send messages to the window. And similarly, you've got a listener inside the window, inside the iframe that's listening to messages from the parent window. So with that architecture, and post message was designed specifically to work cross-origin. So it is designed explicitly and intended by the browser makers as a way for websites from different domains to communicate in a way that's sufficiently high level that it doesn't present a security risk. So using that technique turns out to be incredibly powerful. So the first thing I was looking at was plugin installation. In that scenario, what we would do is create an iframe dynamically that points to an HTML file that isn't a TiddlyWiki. It's just a simple scrap of HTML and a big ball of JavaScript. And that little HTML file represents the plugin library. It puts up an event listener listening for messages coming from the parent window, and the parent window is able to send messages to that plugin iframe saying what plugins do you have, and give me the text of a particular plugin. So those two methods are enough to get started with a plugin library. And in the case of give me the text of a plugin, the plugin library HTML file uses XML HTTP request to request the JSON of that plugin from the server. So that's obviously an asynchronous process. And critically, that's the piece that the hosting page couldn't do. So the hosting page isn't able to use XML HTTP requests to access the right JSON file to retrieve the plugin. However, it can talk to the HTML file sitting in an iframe, and because that HTML file is on the same domain, on the same server as the JSON files containing the plugin, that does work. So I've at breakneck pace taken you through in sort of classic tech essay style two approaches that didn't work, and then I've talked my way very swiftly through a proposal that does work. And so where have we got to? That Jeremy was looking at a way that TiddlyWiki documents could talk to the main tiddlywiki.com server to retrieve plugins, encountered cross-origin problems, and has discovered window post message as the solution. So none of that sounds that interesting until I started thinking more about what we could do with that interface. So the first problem was, what format should the messages take that represent requests like give me a plugin? And to begin with, I was doing it a little bit like messages, DOM messages. So there's a string saying tc dash something dash something dash something that identifies the message with parameters that are specific to the message. But then I realized that what the plugin was actually doing was, oh, so sorry, I just saw a message there which makes me think that I might be just about to miss a doctor's appointment. Never mind. Oh, and so now I've distracted myself. That I'm so sorry. Was anybody following closely enough to be able to remind me exactly where I was? Otherwise, I'll have to restart at approximately the right place. Nick, I fear I lost you somewhere in there.
Yes, it's rather difficult to follow. There's a message.
Jeremy, you have been at the data format that you transferred from the iframe to the hosting application.
Oh, thank you, Mario. That's bang on. Yes. So, and then I suddenly realized that the message format that would be most interesting to use was HTTP. So my new proposal is now we can assemble all those pieces into a slightly simpler sentence. The TiddlyWiki core code already incorporates a web server component. When you run TiddlyWiki under Node.js, that web server component allows you to connect via HTTP and retrieve pages and make changes and so on. It is, in fact, an API to TiddlyWiki. That JavaScript code, as I say, is in there all the time, including when TiddlyWiki is running in the client. What I'm proposing is to make it so that that same interface, that HTTP interface, is available via window post message. So what that means is that you take an HTTP request, which would consist of things like the verb, get, the URL that you want to retrieve, and headers like the content type and so on, and just mapping those into fields that we can pass in a window post message. And so that then suddenly starts to get really interesting. Sorry, Nick, you've got something.
Yeah. Why not use HTTPS?
Well, HTTPS isn't a separate protocol. HTTPS is still HTTP, but it's just over a secure
but it's
connection.
more secure. Oh, yeah.
So there are security concerns with this window post message stuff, but it's not really the same. I mean, HTTPS uses a secure socket. Window post message is already a secure socket in that nothing else on your computer can listen to traffic going over window.postmessage. So go on.
Is FTP something out of the deep past, or is it still viable?
Well, FTP is still gets used, I guess, but TiddlyWiki is not an FTP server, nor would it be one, nor is the protocol very nice. I mean, the thing about HTTP is that it's a very nice expression of a very simple protocol for retrieving resources. So the reason why it makes sense is partly because it's not so much just that it's ubiquitous, it's that it's actually a really good fit. So it means that we can do a trick that I've done before with TiddlyWiki, which is to take a subsystem that was built for one thing and repurpose it pretty much unmodified for something different. Now what it means though is that we can start to do some really interesting things. So TiddlyWiki is a community of people that a lot of what we do with TiddlyWiki, we don't use as a server. And for a whole bunch of reasons, people in the community find that an attractive proposition. Maybe it's because if you run a server, you've got to keep it patched, and it's a bore and it costs money and so on. And TiddlyWiki gives you a good deal of the same flexibility without buzzing around with a special server. One of the problems with that, though, is that that means that TiddlyWiki is limited to what you can do in the browser. And compared to a server, that's actually some of those are quite heavy limitations. And a key one is federation. So most solutions that you see for federation talk about federating servers. Ward Cunningham's smallest federated wiki project is expressed in exactly those terms. You need a server to be able to federate. And the reason is basically for that same origin policy issue that I mentioned before, that it's only normally when you're at a server that you have the freedom to make an HTTP request to an arbitrary IP address. So what we can do with the technology that I've described is build exactly the kind of federated solutions that we've discussed on previous Hangouts. So let me take you through an example. Let's say Jeremy and Nick. So Jeremy has a wiki that's published on TiddlySpot, say. I add a comment to that wiki, then save my wiki back to TiddlySpot. Nick fires up his wiki. His wiki wants to look to see whether there's any updates from Jeremy. So it loads Jeremy's wiki in an iframe and asks over the JavaScript API into the iframe for the latest items, which are then returned from the iframe back into Nick's page. Nick then gets a user interface showing that here's a comment from Jeremy. Nick might choose to keep or discard that comment. If he keeps it, then he's keeping a copy in his own wiki. The purpose of doing that is so that he can weave it into his own notes. So it's tied back to Jeremy's wiki, which is where the master copy of the comment exists, and Nick has created a forked copy of that comment. And then let's say that he writes a comment against it, so that would be another tiddler that is perhaps tagged with the name of that one. And then he saves the result to TiddlySpot. Then Jeremy later starts up his wiki and he runs an update sweep, which will load, let's say, a whole series of wikis while I'm making coffee, probably because it's not going to be that quick, including Nick's, and up pops Nick's reply to my earlier message, and then the process can repeat. I can write a reply to that. So, and then for anybody else that comes along, they can go to Nick's site or they can go to my site and they'll see the conversation. But the version of the conversation that they'll see is contextified differently. And that's, so it's the same content, but sitting in Jeremy's site and sitting in Nick's site, they'll be part of a different corpus of thought that we are choosing to publish on TiddlySpot. So I'm really excited about that. That's one of that idea of federated discussion is something that's been knocking around for quite a long time. It's been of interest to me in TiddlyWiki 5 for a while. It's obviously been a primary pursuit of the smallest federated wiki project. My concern has always, or disappointment has always been that on the face of it, we will need to use Node.js in order to do all the interesting federating things. What I've actually found over the last 2 or 3 years is that an awful lot of people really want to just stay using TiddlyWiki in the browser. So being able to offer those people the ability to do federation in the browser, I think, is a massive step forwards. So I could show you some of that very briefly, but it's a very techie demo.
Just one question. So if I'm interested to also to communicate with you and Nicholas, how do you get notified that I have to say something?
Via some other channel, possibly.
Okay.
I mean, when we're building communication systems, I think we're building things that are going to slot into quite a big existing world. And for me personally, I really love Twitter, and Twitter already works really well for me as a kind of notification mechanism. Okay. So I would, to the degree that TiddlyWiki is an attempt to build what used to be called a social system, and it's actually not really necessarily that at all, but to the degree it is, I would want it to interoperate with other things. And I don't just mean Twitter, I also mean the open federated alternatives to Twitter, so that any TiddlyWiki thing can do what it does best, and leave those other systems to deal with notifications and all that kind of clamor. So I was going to just I appreciate that not everybody is gagging to look at code, but I'm just going to bring it up quickly because a couple of the major points I want to make are actually very easy to see.
I'm just going to cut in real quick with a comment. I have been actually asking around with my younger siblings and people in their schools with the federation idea, and all of them seem to really like it as long as they can incorporate things like Imager and Twitter and things like that into it. All of them really like the idea as something as an alternate to Facebook, just as a possible audience for this.
That's really cool, and I think that what you've just said echoes obviously Steve's remarks earlier about what students are already being familiar with digital media, and I think by working better with existing media, with existing social systems, I think it would make it a lot easier for people to accept TiddlyWiki. So in the past, I've looked at simple things that we could do, like make it so that when you tweet a link to a tiddler, that Twitter gets a Twitter card, which has rich information for the tiddler in it. That kind of thing, making it so that sharing a TiddlyWiki link on Facebook does the right thing. Those sorts of things. But federation, obviously, is the thing that makes all of that get much more interesting. Okay, so back to screen sharing. So now I can run this actually in Chrome. So this version of the pre-release has it's kind of a half-done, half-baked experiment, but you can see there's a link here to a tiddler called official plugin library. If we look at the fields of it, one of the fields is URL, and that's pointing to localhost, to my own server, but that would be tiddlywiki.com/library/index.html. So I'm running a little mini HTTP server to serve that file. If I try and look at that URL from, I think I can look at it in Firefox, yeah. So that's that URL, the plugin library, and there it is in a tiddler. When I click open, it then opens that plugin library, and in response it creates this status tiddler that gives the status of loaded to the plugin library with that URL. And if you look down here, you can see that the plugin library received a message with the verb get and the URL library/JSON, and that then the server, well, it calls it fed message, but it means the main wiki receives a get response consisting of the actual, and if we open it up, with a body consisting of the actual plugin. Sorry, that's the plugin listing, in fact. And if I, up here, if I click load plugin from library, it should, okay, no, it doesn't at the moment, but it should, that would load a specific plugin from the library. And if I can...
Jeremy, are these libraries already part of the HTML, or does the HTML request it from the server?
Which the...
So is this a full-blown library, or is it just an index file, and the index file also goes to the server and requests the file?
That's, I see exactly what you're asking, and that is exactly what I was going to show you. This is the, I don't know why I'm showing it to you here, but this is the source of that library file of library index.html. So in fact, yeah, I should be looking at it in here. We do Control U. So you can see baked into the file is a catalog of all of the assets.
Yeah.
And then there's a little bit of JavaScript that basically adds an event listener for window messages. Yeah. And then we listen for get, and then we've got routing logic, just like you would in a web server, for figuring out what is being requested. And it's a bit messy, to tell you the truth. This is built by TiddlyWiki, so in fact the complicated thing about it was getting to it to be able to build that file, if you see what I mean. Yeah, so I was just, I was going to show you code, but I think that's probably enough code. So it kind of works, and haven't run into any obvious problems. Quite a few things would need to be done to see this idea through. So at the moment, I haven't connected the server, HTTP server mechanism to the window message mechanism. But that, I think, is the interesting potential. As a side effect, what I'd be trying to do is to make that server connection stuff work uniformly, both for servers that are spoken to via a HTML file in an iframe, and for servers that you talk to in the usual way with XML HTTP requests. And so it's the beginnings, possibly, of a general purpose HTTP I/O mechanism, so that we can start to do things like generic support for retrieving information from APIs. And you'll probably have seen, but a lot of HTTP APIs, like the GitHub API, are incredibly simple to query. So for us to make it possible to make server requests to GitHub, I don't think we'd even need a special GitHub plugin. It would just be the generic HTTP connection stuff that people would use.
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting approach, because I did read, but I didn't find the link again. Mozilla already implemented this post message request for service workers. So in the service worker is something like a driver in the background that is even active if you close Firefox. So it can show you some notifications if there is a new plugin or something like this, which would be really interesting if there is a new response.
That's very interesting.
But I didn't find the post. But I think this would be really interesting. So I like this approach, and it is a really good approach. Also, it would work, I think, with drag and drop import or something like this. So it could be the same UI. Someone sends me
absolutely
a file.
Yeah, if I drag in the URL of an HTML file, it could say, "Is that a TiddlyWiki file that you want to federate with?" Yeah, absolutely. There's two interesting TiddlyDesktop things as well. One is that in TiddlyDesktop, instead of loading the library, etc., as an iframe, we could load them as top-level TiddlyDesktop windows and make it efficient for TiddlyDesktop windows to talk to each other via that mechanism. So one would be able to be simultaneously editing a bunch of wikis that happily federate in between one another. If I change a tiddler in one wiki that's federated into another wiki, it would change automatically. And the other thing would be for TiddlyDesktop could expose the HTTP interface that a standalone HTML file is publishing via window post message back over HTTP. In other words, allowing the hosted TiddlyWiki files to sort of tunnel through TiddlyDesktop out over real HTTP. And that's pretty awesome. That would mean I'd be able to spin up 10 different wikis, all independently on my machine at home, and then connect to them from any machine on the internet and make changes to any of those wikis, whilst, thus they're behaving like a client-server wiki, whilst I still have the advantages of them being a standalone wiki. So, yeah, pretty excited about it. And I also think I can maybe express it in a way that might make an interesting technical article for the outside world. So something in the back of my mind that I've been thinking I should be doing more of is, like, I encounter lots of interesting JavaScript, DOM, Node.js issues, and have to get over them or work around them in the TiddlyWiki development, and I very seldom write them up. And yet, that's the backbone of most of the technical journalism on the net is pretty much that. I came across this interesting problem and I spun it up into an article. And I think this idea of tunneling HTTP over window post message is completely new as far as I can see. I can't see any other projects that do it. But it feels magical. It's magical because only TiddlyWiki could do it. It's only because TiddlyWiki server-side is isomorphic and it's possible for the server to run in the client that it's even remotely feasible. Other projects like React trying to explore isomorphism by getting their browser components running on the server. And, well, we did that long ago. So it's an area that might be of kind of general interest to developers, and the implementation, the bits that I've done so far, which is fairly modest experimentation, it all seems to work astonishingly.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting.
Awesome. Well, as usual, so much that we didn't get to discuss. My list has on it wanting to talk about smallest federated wiki some more, wanting to talk about the TinCanX API project, wanting to talk about how we manage tickets on GitHub. But all of that will have to wait for another time. So, any comments from anybody before I close? I'm planning to have the Hangout as usual next week, so we'll hopefully look forward to seeing everybody then. But before closing, it's just for me to say a huge thank you to all of you for coming. Alberto, Ed, Jed, Mario, Nathan, Nick and Steve, I really appreciate you giving up your time. It's, for me, always a really interesting and rewarding session. I'm a bit horrified that I did so much talking this time, but that does sometimes happen, I guess. But very happy to have heard from Steve, Nick and a few others during the call. So I say, massive thank you to you. Much appreciate your contribution, and I'll look forward to seeing you next week. And with that, cheerio, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.